Talk Show. Recorded live.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you may be across the nation or around the world. Once again, you're listening to the VMware Community's Roundtable Podcast. This is podcast number 578. My name is Eric Nilsson. With me today, I have Corey Romero, my co-host. Today is Wednesday, October 27th, 2021. Corey, how's it going?
Going well. Things are well. We had, again, a huge snowstorm come into Utah and, buried the front yard, backyard. But it's exciting. Best part of it is I got to teach my 16-year-old son at 7 a.m. on how to drive in the snow down our mountains. So, things are great.
Very fun. Well, that's great. That's great. And we did have a big storm here in California as well. So I'll talk a little bit about that. But let's talk about what we got on the show today. Today, we are going to be talking about Project Antrea. Antrea is a enablement networking and network policy component that guys have written. I think it's an open source project. It connects Kubernetes clusters together. And so we have with us Antonin, Bas, and Madhu. We'll get to them in a second, talking all about the open source project that's out there to build you a Kubernetes network fabric. And that project is Antrea. So we're going to talk about that. That should be fun. But before we do that, talk a little bit about the news. So yes, the weather in California, there's an interesting piece. We had a storm came through, one of the biggest storms we've had in multiple years, right? More rain. It dumped a foot of rain, 12 inches of rain up north of San Francisco, up into the Marin County area. So can you imagine 12 inches of rain in 24 hours? It's like, it's some flooding. Interesting thing is up in the Sierras, we've been in a drought for a year, and Lake Tahoe has, everybody's been complaining that Lake Tahoe is losing water. The pristine lake is going to be bad. It's the doom and gloom of the drought, right? The lake is overflowing now. So one rainstorm drops a foot of rain and the lake is now overflowing. So that's good news for us. It's great to get that water, and it has been stormy and now it's sunny again. So, but we're supposed to get some more rain in a couple days. So California is happily wet. I think we didn't have rain for one entire year. So good to have the rain back, and good that you guys got some snow. Any kind of news that we want to talk about here for going into Q4? I think that the one thing I'll do a shout out is if you happen to be in APJ, Japan or China, there is VMworld's going to happen. There's a VMworld for Japan that's going to be happening, which is kind of like the VForms of last few years. We're going to now have a VMworld Japan, which is fairly much like a VForm rebranded, but that should be fun for them. So if you're in the APJ region, go look out for that. I think they're going to do a hybrid approach where it's going to be online again in different locales. So look forward to that. And in China, there's going to be another VMworld China. So if you're in China, you're probably not listening to this podcast, but you might be. And if you are, go register for a VMworld China. And so the momentum season continues on. So that's good to know. Corey, is there any other things that the experts should know about the next month?
We do have a couple webinars coming up. They're not confirmed yet, but watch your email. I'll be sending out email either late this week or early next for those webinars. Also want to do a shout out to Pamela, who runs the vExpert Avi program. They had a Avi and Kubernetes webinar this morning. So great work.
Very good. Very good. Shout out to them. Good job on that. And so with that, we'll get to our guests. And as always, we'll do a little bit of an introduction, and then we'll hear from them about how they got where they are. Then we'll get into Project Antrea. So first, we'll start with Antonin. Am I saying that right?
Yep.
Welcome to the show. Tell me a little bit about your career arc. How did you work at VMware now? Your title is staff engineer in the network business and R&D. Tell me how you got here and what do you do at VMware?
So my career is not that long. I don't think I've hit the 10-year mark yet, but basically I've been in networking pretty much the whole time. When I was at Stanford doing my master's, I studied networking and security and systems. And then right after Stanford, I joined a startup company in Palo Alto called Barefoot Networks, which was making network ASICs for data center switches, so processing packet at high speeds in data centers, whether it's enterprise or cloud data centers. And I was there for 5 years, pretty much from the beginning until the acquisition by Intel. And after that, I wanted to do something new, something more software related, because Barefoot Networks was hardware company at the core, even though I was doing software there. And I wanted to do a little bit of Kubernetes, but still remain, under that networking / systems umbrella. And so I think I got the opportunity to join VMware to work specifically on an open source project, which was also something I was doing at Barefoot, a lot of open source work. And so that was very interesting to me. And so I joined, and I've been working on Project Antrea for the last 2 years.
Yeah, nice. That's super cool. I'm jealous for having gotten to exposure in the hardware space, right? Because it's fun to build ASICs. I assume you guys designed ASICs and then use fabs over, in Taiwan to actually have the ASICs made.
Exactly. So I think it was an interesting experience. It's very hard to be a startup company in that space and to compete with people like Broadcom, right? I mean, just getting the fabs to getting that those window of times where they're going to produce your chips, and then any hardware issue can be like a catastrophe because the cycles are so long, right? And so so expensive to do a respin. And so I think it was a very interesting experience. It's a hard space to be in when you're a startup. You need like a lot of funding. The market is growing, but is not that huge, right? It's not something that's unlimited,
right.
and Broadcom captures a big part of it. So, but I'm glad I'm more doing software now, but it was definitely a good experience.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I know I've talked to several people, even people that know Pat over Intel now, and in the chip space, to get your own chip made, even if you just get a slice of a wafer, right? Like it's like $18 million just to get a slice of a wafer to build a custom chipset. So, and that's just for to do the die, and that's sharing that cost with like 3 other vendors who will get that wafer. So it is a super expensive space to be in. So but it's still pretty cool. So yeah, that's a fun experience. All right, with that, we'll move to Madhu. Madhu, welcome to the show. Madhu is Senior Technical Product Manager for NSBU. So Madhu, welcome to the show. What do you do, and how's your career got you here?
Thank you. Hey, hello everyone. Madhu, or Madhukar Krishnarao.
What is your last name? Say it again, because I couldn't pronounce it.
It's Krishnarao.
Krishnarao. All right, great.
Yes.
Thanks. Yep.
So it's Madhukar Krishnarao, or just call me Madhu. I guess that's more easier. Where do I start? My life in VMware actually started around 2007, way back in 2007. I used to work as a device driver developer for ESXi 3.0, 3.5 timeframe. That's where it started. So, and throughout my career in VMware, my kind of interest and focus has been on networking. So worked on device drivers a little bit, then a little bit on the TCP IP stack, distributed switches. And then when the networking and business unit, security business unit got formed, I got an opportunity to kind of formally get into the networking space. In between, around 2015, I think, I moved out. I wanted to try my hands on being a solution architect. So I went out of the company. That was pretty good too. It was in a company called New Age Networks. And then I got an opportunity to come back and work as a technical product manager with VMware within the business unit. So here I am. It's been a fun journey because when you're a developer, you look at things in a certain way. You're focused on certain aspects of things. But then when you're a solution architect or when you're talking to customers, it's a different perspective that you're looking at, especially about problems or how you solve something. And now with all of these, I think if I have a chance to get back as an engineer, I'll definitely be a much better engineer than I was before. Obviously, the experience and the opportunities that has come along the way. Yeah, before that, I used to work in a small startup in San Jose, then IBM, Verizon Business, and yeah, it's
Are both of you? Antonin is obviously in California because he mentioned a California startup. Are you also in the Bay Area?
Yes, I'm also in the Bay Area. Yes, and I did enjoy both the rain and the sunshine that's there right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I
Well,
didn't enjoy the rain too much. I think I felt that those 5 inches of rain in my backyard. Fortunately, the ground can absorb it pretty fast here with the Bay Area sandy soil, but there was still a bit of a flood going on when it was raining. Yeah.
I went out and drove around and walked around and just enjoyed the different perspective of seeing everything storming and wet. It was a lot of fun. And Madhu, I got to just say, if you did drivers, like hex is your friend, right? Like everything is sending hex lines, hex numbers down the line. Like,
I completely agree. Although it's been quite some time though.
Yeah, I did some drivers for small Raspberry Pi stuff where I got hardware and then just was pulling data from sensors, doing it in C, and it's just a lot of hex work, right? It's a lot of fun. All right.
Oh yes.
Yeah, good to meet both of you. Thank you for giving us a little bit of perspective. And Antonian, why don't you tell us a little bit about the problem space that you've been working on with Antrea, and we'll go from there. So tell us a little bit about the problem space and your approach to it. It's obviously open source. Just give us some history of what you're doing.
Yeah. So when I joined VMware, right? VMware did have NSBU did have like a networking solution for container and still has it. And it's called NCP, Network Container Plugin, and it's basically a part of NSX, right? It connects containers to NSX logical switches, just like you would connect VMs to logical switches. And it wasn't very like Kubernetes native in that sense, right? And you did need to have NSX running to be able to have that networking solution for your Kubernetes containers. And so at that time, people in the BU thought it would be a good idea to start a project that would be more Kubernetes native and would be independent of NSXT while still being able to integrate with NSXT to unlock additional capabilities, for example. I think at the time, people looked at what was available in terms of open source solution, and we felt like if we wanted to check those two checkboxes, achieve those two goals, right? We kind of like needed to start our own solution, and we saw a few gaps in the available open source solutions as well, right? In terms of network policy model for the enterprise, in terms of like Windows support, which was kind of like very new at the time in Kubernetes, and so we thought it would be a good idea to start an open source project, take like a bit of a different approach to Kubernetes networking with a different data path technology, and at the same time make sure that the project we created would be something that could be easily integrated in other virtual networking solutions such as NSXT.
Yeah, it is interesting because I did 2 years ago Kubernetes on Raspberry Pi for VMworld. I just did tech sessions where showed how to install Kubernetes, get it up, get a bunch of Raspberry Pi 3s running, and then a Raspberry Pi for the master node. But then you need the network connectivity and the network layer, right? And so then we have to go to open source to get those. And it's kind of hit or miss what you get. There's like 3 or 4 different network solution module, I don't know what I'd call them, but fabrics, right? That from vendors, and I forget the names of them, and we chose one. But it is kind of this using open source. Depends on who the contributors are, depends on who spun up the project. How reliable this is going to be, and it's fun for Kubernetes, right? You don't really care that much as long as you get it up and running and working. It was fun, right? But when you start talking about production level workloads, if you want to have a fabric that's not super heavyweight, that you want to use just for some entry level stuff, you do have to choose somebody, a group. And then if you want a path to get to production level, real Kubernetes running in the enterprise where you have scale, then what you've chosen, right? Does it give you a path to get where you need to go? So I could see the need for that. At least I kind of understand why we would kind of do that. Build our own open source project that offers this, bring some enterprise level kind of thought processes around building that layer, and then hiring a guy like you to go do it. That makes sense. So how long have you been at it?
For 2 years. I've been there for the whole lifespan of the project so far. And yeah, you're right. When it comes to networking, Kubernetes doesn't help you much, especially for bare metal deployments, right? You were mentioning kind of like a Raspberry Pi based clusters there. So Kubernetes doesn't help you much. And you basically have to go out and get one of those open source solutions. And behind each one of those open source solutions, there is actually a different company, right? And so you choose an open source solution, you basically choose one of those companies in the end. And yeah, if you want to get support for your production workloads, and you end up buying support from that company. And in a way, we have the same model with Antrea, even though we try to put all the features we have out there in the open source project for people to be able to use, whether they are a customer of VMware or not. And we also donated Antrea to the CNCF, which is the foundation behind Kubernetes. So we really try to have that transparent open source governance.
Right. So do you guys, how do you track usage? How do you track whether people are discovering this? I know you've done a code session that showed how you guys set it up with an open framework, and so that was kind of neat. But do you guys look at downloads, project contributions? I know you can contribute right to the project. Why don't we talk a little bit about how do people get this, and is anybody using it?
Yeah, it's we do track what you mentioned, right? You can look at Docker image downloads and things like this, stars on GitHub's contributors. We have actually a pretty large number of contributors. I think we're at about 90 right now. Yeah, you don't get those exact usage numbers because telemetry in open source projects is usually frowned upon, right? I mean, even for projects you sell to enterprises now, you need all those disclaimers and the ability to opt out easily and things like this. Well, in open source projects, telemetry is kind of frowned upon, especially when you're part of the CNCF. So we're never going to get that kind of perfect usage data. And so
yeah, I guess if you download it and you have the zip, you have the bits, you compile them, or you download the precompiled, I can share it around to any number of people in my enterprise, and you'd be using it, and you don't really get any metrics on any of that.
Yeah, and it's really misleading. If you look at container downloads, the number of times an image is pulled from the registry, right? This, depending on the setup, I can have a cluster with 1,000 nodes, and each one of those nodes will pull the image once, and that's going to count as one download. But maybe you're using a local registry, right, where you just cache the image, and then all your nodes are going to pull from that, and so you only see one download. And then we have test team systems that run all the time that actually account for a good number of downloads, and so those numbers are really really misleading. But Antrea is used in the VMware Kubernetes distribution, right, in all the Tanzo editions. And so I think we do get some usage data from some of those, and I think we have a pretty significant number of clusters out there running Antrea, which is comforting and a good thing to know, and kind of a testament to how Antrea can be used in production.
All right, so Madhu, we were talking before we did the podcast, of Tanzu in general, right? How does this fit into the Tanzu go-to-market kind of strategy? And from a general networking perspective, I mean, Antonin thinks it's entry level. What from a product perspective, where do you see this fitting?
So when you're talking about a platform like Tanzu, right, it obviously needs to solve a couple of things for a customer. One is provide networking. The second one is security. And the third one that you overlook when you're looking at products is ease of use. What kind of resources are available within the customer company that can take on a new CNI, that can take on a new product and then start using it. It's one thing to have a product available, but it's also the level of technical requirements from a usage perspective that also matters. So what we do especially with Tanzu and where Antrea fits really well is, one, it solves a lot of these problems. If you look at the recent CNCF survey, right, the number one thing that customers typically complained about was, hey, when you talk about Kubernetes, things seem very complex to me. can you simplify that? And the number two thing was about visibility and security. That like 40-50% of the people who took that survey just consistently gave us this feedback. So what Tanzu does is kind of abstracts these things out for you. So with Antrea, it uses Antrea as the default CNI throughout. So you get enterprise class networking, security, but from a usage, from a user consumption perspective, it's pretty seamless. Clusters come up, the pods are there, the pods can talk to each other, the nodes are all connected. You can choose to have NAT, you can choose to have direct routed pods, depending upon what kind of topology you want to do. Everything just works seamlessly. And that's, I think, is also one of the kind of contributors for Antrea actually getting a lot of traction. I mean, we were just talking about how do we track, right? One of the best feedbacks that I've actually got about people like customers and people using Antrea is when somebody who represents a customer walks up to us in let's say like a conference like VMworld, right? And then they say, hey, I was using this, it's really great. I tried the upgrade totally works. And that's when we get to kind of, that's real feedback for us, because you know that people are using it, you know they've actually gone through an upgrade cycle, which typically when you talk about a software can get painful. So it's pretty interesting to see how this is being utilized.
All right, so you brought something to light that I just got to ask because I'm not sure. I want to make sure I understand this. So if you just go pick up Tanzu today, and do I use Antrea as the default network fabric if I don't go through the trouble of trying to select a different network fabric like NSXT or whatever? Like, so it's embedded in Tanzu today, right? And
Yes.
it's the default network environment. And so even though it's open source, we're delivering that as part of our product environment.
That's right. So you can still use Antrea as a CNI, let's say in a standalone Kubernetes cluster, right? You have your Ubuntu VMs or CentOS VMs, whatever it is. You form a cluster. You still need some sort of a CNI there. You can use Antrea if you have, let's say, OpenShift, or if you also talk about public clouds, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, any of these platforms. When you're talking about a Kubernetes cluster, you can always pick Antrea as the CNI even there.
Yeah. All right. So I am humbled. That is awesome. I didn't realize that. I just thought this was an open source project that you could choose to use, like I chose one or two or three of the other open source projects when I was setting up my Kubernetes on Raspberry Pis. But this is actually embedded in Tanzu as a kind of a default easy networking capability. Antonin, when you look at features, right, and keeping up with features, like how many engineers? You said 90 contributors. I guess that's a key component of keeping up with networking technology, is just like how big a team do you have, how fast you have to go, and then is there like this layer of features that you're covering that then if you want a bigger enterprise, you might go to NSXT to do this. Like, where do you find that sweet spot, and how do you keep up with the feature set that's obviously probably moving pretty fast?
So there is a pretty large team. So I mentioned 90 contributors to the open source project. Obviously, a lot of those frequent contributors come from VMware, and you have like a decent amount of contributors in that number of 90, right? Who are just like one-time contributors or contributor just a couple of small things. We also have some contributions from other companies, for example, Intel. And there is a couple of users of Antrea that contributed some features too, which has been nice. So at VMware, there is kind of like, I would say you don't really have people dedicated to just open source Antrea, but we have a pretty large team of people that do contribute to open source Antrea and also work on the different like Antrea integrations we have with VMware products.
Right. So
yep.
So it would be like instead of having a large team, if you had a feature set that needed to be integrated, that engineer might come and contribute a block of code or some function that goes into that, so that then they're working on the project during the time that they're integrating in a feature. Right? Is that kind of part of how that works?
Yeah, you can see that there are features which are driven by the needs of like integrating with other solutions. Sometimes we see an obvious gap, but that doesn't mean that the feature is not a good thing to have in the open source project. And sometimes we have features that we don't really need as VMware, but that make sense in open source Antrea because you want a project to have like some feature-rich capabilities that can benefit to a wide audience. In that case, the team is still going to work on adding the feature unless an external contributor comes in and contributes the feature themselves.
And you mentioned, cloud integration and standards that are out there. So there's standard bodies that define, the interfaces that you have to connect to if you want to connect to, other Kubernetes clusters out there.
So that's a great question. So when you look at the Kubernetes requirements for networking, they're very simple. They say a Kubernetes network plugin, which is going to be a third-party project, right, as we discussed before, needs to provide pod connectivity without NAT, without network address translation. And that's pretty much the only requirement you have, right? And then there is a standard interface called CNI, which stands for Container Network Interface, which is how the container runtime asks your plugin to provision networking for a pod or for a container. And so basically, the most basic responsibility of a Kubernetes network plugin is to implement this standard interface, which is a very simple interface. And that's why a Kubernetes network plugin is often referred to as a CNI plugin, because that's kind of like the core of network plugin. But if you look at all the popular open source projects out there, Antrea, Calico, Cilium, Flannel, and so on, or Weave, typically they do more than just implement that interface. They provide you with network policy APIs so that you can secure your workloads. They provide you with visibility tooling so you can figure out what's going on in your cluster from a networking perspective. And so you end up with like the CNI implementation, that basic connectivity requirement is only like the tip of the iceberg. And all those plugins provide you with like a load of features and try to differentiate from each other with those additional features. And so that interface, CNI, is really the only standard way to integrate with Kubernetes kubelet, the container runtime. And then you have the network policy API, which is standardized by Kubernetes and provides you with a basic abstraction to secure your workloads. But after that, the different network plugins are free to define their own interfaces. And those interfaces are, for example, what we're going to use to integrate with NSXT or with the Avi load balancer, and there is no standard at that level. So when Madhu said that Antrea can be used as a network plugin in the cloud, really that integration relies on the CNI interface, which is used to provision networking, right? The interface, connectivity, the routes, things like this. And then you have the network policy API, which is also common across all those Kubernetes network plugins.
Okay, that makes sense. The CNI and the network policy API are the two APIs, but other than that, you're on your own, and then you're building features and connecting. And I used Weave when I was doing Raspberry Pi, so I get that. And then now you get into the kind of the place where you're choosing a vendor, because the vendor then implements security policy and all kinds of things that then make it a robust solution. So that makes sense. Madhu. What's the challenge here between getting this embedded as a default versus NSXT connectivity, and where do you draw the line? We sell one, the other one's embedded. How do you deal with that, or what's our strategy?
So Antrea is a standalone CLI, right? It works with and without NSX. So what I mean by that is you can have your Kubernetes cluster, as Antonin was saying, right, anywhere. In fact, one of the things that you would see in the Antrea site is it's a CNI and it runs anywhere that Kubernetes runs, and that's true. So you can have Antrea running anywhere. It could be you might have already have apps deployed, doesn't really matter. Now, when you're thinking about like an enterprise use case, right, you might have 50 different clusters, 100 different clusters, all doing different things. And then now suddenly you need a centralized management system, which can at least give you basic form of network policy management. You need to be able to kind of figure out, hey, I want these kind of namespaces to talk to the other namespaces. I don't want these things to talk. And as and when these kind of requirements kind of grow up, you definitely need a centralized policy management. And that's where NSX comes in. So what we offer, or what that's going to be GA'd pretty soon, is NSX Manager acts as the central visibility and policy manager. So you take your already existing Antrea cluster or Kubernetes cluster with Antrea as the CNI. Just integrate that with NSX, and then you're all set. Now, the moment you do that, you start getting all the inventory in NSX. All of the Kubernetes labels are actually converted into NSXT tags. And if you're familiar with NSXT, that would actually mean that you can now create dynamic groups based on these tags. You can use those groups in distributed firewall rules that actually get pushed down back into Antrea and gets realized as the Antrea cluster network policies. So NSX is essentially providing you management plane visibility and control, but the realization is still happening in Antrea. Now, it solves two things as well, right? One, obviously, you now have a central management system. But then on the other side, you can actually really scale very well. You can spawn out like hundreds and then thousands of clusters with Antrea in it, but your NSX manager will be able to very easily handle all of that load, because all it is doing is kind of just on the management side. And extending this kind of integration, right? Not only on the security side, when you're thinking of troubleshooting, container troubleshooting is a topic that most people want to talk about a lot, because there's a lot of things that can go wrong, that you can look at. Trying to look at trace flows, trying to look at packet flows is challenging. So NSX also helps in this place. So NSX already had the trace flow. Antrea by native also has trace flow, so it was very easy to kind of map those two together. I'm sure Antonin can talk a lot about this. So you now have visibility, you now have some stats that are exported, you now have statistics and telemetry in terms of how many packets are going back and forth between these pods, a lot of this information that's available in NSX. So it as I said, it provides this central management opportunity. And it doesn't mean that NSX has to be used only for Antrea. If you already have an NSX system that is kind of doing that's providing overlay network, that's providing microsegmentation for your virtual machines, you can just use your existing NSX manager to kind of control Antrea clusters too.
Okay, that makes sense. I'm going to flip back to Antonin and ask, since you're the father of this project, right? Like, what would you say is your most proudest moment or proudest piece of technology that you've built in and coded for this environment?
Well, I'm not the only father. It's a project with several fathers, but it's a modern family. But I think we're very proud of having been accepted in the CNCF as a sandbox project. I think that was like kind of like a good achievement for us, and I think also being chosen as a default solution for all the Tanzo flavors was really a big deal, right? Because we didn't do that project for nothing. We know that even at VMware, it's basically used for all the container needs now. I think one aspect of the project we're quite proud of is that we managed to have a unified data path implementation between both Linux and Windows. And so that means that a lot of the features we have available for Linux are basically automatically also available on Windows. And that kind of like enables us to provide kind of like that first-class citizen support for Windows nodes in Kubernetes clusters. And I think the Windows use case is kind of growing in the enterprise, right? You're not going to have like clusters with a large number of Windows nodes, but it's not uncommon to have like clusters with a small number of Windows nodes which are going to run Windows-specific services, whether it's databases or
Yes.
or directory, or like Office 365 or whatnot.
Yeah, I was going to say, and as the cloud providers, Azure and others, offer platforms of choice, right? Like you could see that, if you were on Azure, that there would be need to do that. So that's pretty nice, because normally, there wasn't any cross-platform network fabric capability when I was doing Raspberry Pi and using Weave, right? It was like, you're on this platform, this is what you're on. This is the OS you run. Have a nice day, right? And that was that. So interesting. How much do you get along with Madhu? Right, like because you're engineering, open source. Sometimes product guys they drive you crazy. How much obviously he's here. We can pretend he's not here. There is sometimes tension between open source projects and products. How do you feel that's going?
So on my side, I mostly focus on the open source side of things. I don't feel the tension too much. We do feel it a little bit. Very often, my take is to do what's best for the open source projects to keep that credibility. You can always find like a workaround when you integrate with a VMware product. I think that it's obvious that the needs of the business are also going to drive feature prioritization, right? Obviously, we have VMware developers working on that project. If we need something first, we're going to work on that thing first, right? But that's not conflicting with the concept of doing a good open source project with transparent governance, right? It's just the way things are. But we wouldn't put something in the open source project that's not good for the open source project. I think.
Right. I think that's what I was getting at. It's like, how is VMware? I could rephrase that product, which you've answered that question, which is, how is VMware doing as an open source contributor, right? Like, because sometimes companies get that, like, no, we want our stuff and we're going to drive the standard and we're not going to play in a way that's like a comfortable way to work with open source community members, right? And so, sounds like we're doing okay.
I think so. And I think VMware used to have a terrible reputation in the open source world in general. And I think that's really changed in the last couple of years with changes made in the VMware open source program office, right? And very high number of VMware contributions to projects like Kubernetes. I think in terms of Kubernetes, VMware is like the second or third largest contributor in terms of number of contributions. And so I think VMware has really put its weight behind Kubernetes, and we've been playing nicely with the community, and I think that's really helping VMware's reputation there.
How are we doing with Joe Beta and the whole Kubernetes, core foundation people? Are you tied into that? Is this the open source and Joe Beta and everybody that then also works at the product side? I'm just curious, do you guys work as a collective when we're talking about contributing to various open source projects? And I know he's still around and, contributing and driving things as well.
So Joe was really influential at the beginning of the project. I think we took a lot of feedback from him. He made some introductions. We took his feedback, his experience based on everything he did in Appsio in consideration, right? And he helped kind of popularize Antrea a bit in the podcast and things like this. He started a podcast which is TGIK. Thank God it's Kubernetes, which airs on Fridays, right? And he did an episode on Antrea. So I think we really took Joe's advice on how to do things the right way early on in the project, and now we have another VMware employee, Davenham. He goes by Dims, who is a member of the steering committee for Kubernetes, and we also really take in steering committee for the CNCF, and we really take his advice into consideration when it comes to how we manage the project upstream.
Nice. Madhu, it seems like from my perspective, we're actually making real traction in Kubernetes these days with Tanzu, and the idea that you could just have vSphere 7, and if I go to my powers to be and just say, oh, you need Kubernetes platform, we've got that. In fact, we've got it in a standard way, in an open source way, and in an enterprise support way, in a management plane way. I can just imagine, I used to run a data center. I used to be a VP of a $100 million company. And, we would have consultants come in and make recommendations for our 3-year purchase plans, and technology roadmaps. And I could just see from my perspective, if I were doing this and I were looking at trying, I would just be like, yeah, let's just turn that on for, all our vSphere environments and or at least build a section of vSphere environments that's enabled. And that just becomes my Kubernetes infrastructure. And I don't have to buy much new.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It makes sense, right? Because if you think about it, when VMware, it kind of exploded initially with virtualization. It gave the ability to kind of give you on-demand virtual machines for anybody. And if you're a VI admin, all you have to do is spin up a new VM, give it to whoever asked for it, and they can just use the VM as their own, but they're not like worried about maintaining it and kind of managing it, right? The same thing is actually now applicable to Kubernetes too. If I'm an app developer, all I need is like a Kubernetes cluster, either to do development, to do testing of my app, and maybe I don't really need to be bothered too much about where my cluster is running, or what is my CNI, what kind of enterprise grade security is implemented. All I'm maybe worried about is, hey, can my database and my application talk to each other? Are those ports open? And I'm pretty much happy with that. So for these kind of use cases, right? If converting your vSphere cluster into a Kubernetes cluster and then creating guest clusters on demand makes total sense. And I can see why it is getting popular, mainly because of this. From an infrastructure perspective, you can treat this as a IaaS platform. You just spin up clusters on demand. They're available whenever it's needed, and the developer themselves are not kind of bogged down about, hey, did I get the kubectl version right, or any of those things.
Yeah, nice. All right, as we transition to the last 10 minutes of the show here, I always like to ask, like, so where are we going? And I know that you can't particularly in product land, but Antonin, you're in open source. Maybe you have some more flexibility. What do you see excites you for next year? What are you guys going to be working on? Are there any things that you can talk about on where your vision is taking this forward?
So we have some very cool features, incoming features, right? We're looking at doing things like layer 7 network policies, where you go beyond just like firewall rules, which are expressed in terms of like community spots, but are essentially enforced at the IP level, right? So it's really like a traditional firewall in that sense. It's just you have a nice little Kubernetes abstraction on top of that. So looking to move beyond that and look into like layer 7 network policies. You can like define those policies in terms of like HTTP request, for example, which is like a very powerful tool for someone deploying workloads to Kubernetes. We're looking at things like IDS, IPS. What can we do in Antrea as a project? Looking at things like improving our integrations with cloud providers, right? One big news for us this year was the Google team announced that they were previewing official Antrea support for Kubernetes with Windows nodes. And so if you want to deploy a GKE managed cluster on Google Cloud, and you want to include Windows nodes in your GKE clusters, and Antrea is going to be used to provide networking on those Windows nodes. So it was like great news for us. We work with the Google team to make that happen, and they really drove a lot of innovations in the project, which was good. So we're looking to improve our integration with cloud providers. Multi-cluster is like a big deal, right? If you have like different clusters all running Antrea, how can you like have workload connectivity between those clusters, but also enforce policies for traffic across those clusters? So Madhu mentioned how NSXT lets you federate those clusters under the same management plane, and so you can define policies which are going to be copied to every cluster and enforced in every cluster. But that's still like local enforcement, right? If I have multiple clusters with services talking to each other across Kubernetes clusters, how do I enforce policies on that traffic? How do I provide connectivity for that traffic across clusters? So something very exciting that we're currently looking at.
Nice. Madhu, coming into next year, who are our competitors and how are we doing with them? Right, like there's certain the experts and people that deal with competitive situations. Right, we're always trying to sell our products and engage. Who else is in this space? Like I look at this and I'm like, there aren't very many vendors. Maybe IBM with Red Hat, their whole stack gets into this. But is there anybody else out there? And how are we doing?
So you mentioned IBM, right? Red Hat and IBM. So in fact, with OpenShift, even though OpenShift has OpenShift SDN, which comes as default in their cluster, we do have quite a few of our customers who pick Antrea as the CNI. mainly because of the features like that's available that Antonin was talking about, right? That's one aspect, right? Even internally, we did talk a lot about Tanzu and how Antrea is the default CNI, and it was not so before. When Tanzu was initially introduced, Antrea was not the CNI because one, there was a third-party CNI that was available as default. But then slowly we have been able to win everybody over, and that's pretty good. So in terms of what others do as well, right? You can look at any other CNI out there in the market. They have both open source. Some of them have an enterprise solution too. But then most customers, when they pick a product, they're also looking in terms of, okay, is it a single, I don't know, like a choking point? Can I just pick up one 1-800 number and just call them up, or do I need to call like 5 different people? All of these things do matter. And VMware, what we are kind of going towards is having like a single stack, like end-to-end stack, that gives you not only your physical underlay, your overlay, your container networking, security, visibility. Antonin mentioned IDS, IPS, more in terms of intelligence within your Kubernetes cluster, service connectivity. So if you think of a lot about this, it actually makes more sense to just stick with an end-to-end solution. And we have actually been getting a lot of requests in this regard.
Nice. All right. Well, we have 5 minutes left here. So CNI, Container Network Interface. Antonin, thanks for coming from Stanford and the great environment there and ending up at VMware and continue to work here. It's a pleasure to have such sharp engineers in that whole stack, computer science stack is a thanks for being here and doing that work. And I'm glad you feel it's rewarding. Are you on any social networks? Do you guys have a blog? What is your GitHub repository? How do people, that are interested connect with you and your project?
So most of the interactions are on GitHub. We also have a Slack channel for the Antrea project, which is part of the community's Slack workspace. So if you join the community Slack workspace, which anyone can do, you can look up the Antrea channel and chat with us live. And that's a very interactive way to do it. If you have any problem with Antrea, any question, you can also open an issue on GitHub, and we're pretty reactive with how we deal with those requests as well. And I think lastly, Antrea has a Twitter handle. I think it's @ProjectAntrea. So you can tweet at us and follow that if you want to know about the latest news, know about the latest Antrea releases and things like this.
All right. So @ProjectAntrea, ANTREA.
Yeah.
Okay. And then you can just go to GitHub and search on that and join the project if you want. And then you can also go to Slack, join the Kubernetes Slack channel, and then sub-channel Antrea.
Yeah, and Antrea.io, the website, is also kind of like a one-stop shop where you can find the links to all those things I just mentioned.
All right, great, perfect. Madhu, I always ask that as we wrap up. How do people find you? Are you on Twitter? Is there a Twitter handle that you guys do? Do you guys have a blog? How do people keep track of all the networking stuff that's happening?
Most of my contributions directly go to the VMware blog site. So you can reach me through that. Or you can also reach me on my GitHub. It's Madhukar K. That's my GitHub ID. You can definitely reach out to me from there.
Spell that MADHUK.
KARK.
Oh, KARK. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Madhukar K. Got it. All right. All right. Well, thanks a lot for coming here, talking about it. Go check this out. Congratulations to being the default networking, CNI there. I did not know that. So that's learning for me today. So appreciate that. And good job on all the work you guys have been doing. And thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for
the invite, Eric. It was great.
That was great. All right. With that, we'll be back again next week. We're booked all the way throughout the rest of the year. So just come back and say hello to us. You can join us live at vmw.re/pod and ask some questions. We run this on TalkShoe as well as we stream it on YouTube. So go check us out at vbarbecue, youtube.com/vbarbecue. And with that, we will hit the big red stop button. Have a great day, everyone.